Thank you everybody for joining us. You're here with Microsoft Power BI, the UK user group. And today we have Christian Wade with us. Now, Christian is the program manager at Microsoft for the Power BI engineering team. He's also very familiar with the Microsoft Data Platform, having worked with Analysis Services, Power BI, Azure Analysis Services, and pretty much the whole Microsoft Power Data Platform suite of tools. He's also a regular key speaker in large conferences, and he's also the creator of the Business Normalizer, which was the diff merge tool, which we now see today as ALM Toolkit. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Christian to present his session on ALM Toolkit.
Thank you very much indeed, Leon. Hello, everybody. Great to see you all. So as Leon said, we can keep it quite interactive. You know, feel free to post questions in the chat window. Leon can ping me. Or even if you want, Leon, we can even let the odd question come directly from the audience. It's up to you. But yeah, good to see you all and happy to be here. Let me see where most of you are calling in from. I think UK, I suspect mostly in the UK. So, all right. So yeah, I'm Christian Wade. As Leon said, I've been in America, I lose count now, but 15 years now. And I've been in Redmond for 5 years. And as Leon said, I'm program management lead for the kind of, I call it the semantic modeling in Power BI, but it's kind of the enterprise BI use case that traditionally used to be more focused on analysis services. Obviously, you know, with SQL Server Analysis Services, we have a rich history. SQL Server Analysis Services is actually over 20 years old now, and it was around even before SQL Server 2000. It was first launched in SQL Server 7 as OLAP services in, I think, 1998. So, you know, over 20 years ago, we've been dominating the enterprise BI market, you know, and we're the only vendor to be ranked in the leaders quadrant in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for 14 years in a row. 14 years ago, it was all about enterprise BI. You know, self-service BI wasn't even a recognized thing. And so we have a rich heritage in this kind of enterprise BI space. And we have brought that enterprise BI into Power BI. So Power BI Premium is now widely recognized by, you know, the leading research agencies as the leading platform for both enterprise and self-service BI. So I'm responsible, me and my PM team are responsible for bringing that kind of traditional enterprise BI workload that was traditionally just for analysis services into Power BI. And in reality, the Power BI dataset is based on analysis services. We have analysis services, we have the analysis services engine running right there in the background, right? So anyway, I'm going to jump straight into ALM Toolkit. And like I said, we can keep things pretty interactive. And if you want to talk about other things as well, that's fine too. So let me go ahead and share my desktop. So let's see. Just get this going here. So ALM Toolkit, it's a diff and merge tool for analysis services tabular models. And as I said, because the Power BI dataset is built on the analysis services tabular engine, it works for Power BI datasets in premium and premium per user and Power BI embedded as well. It doesn't work on Pro because Pro doesn't support the Xmla endpoint, which we'll talk about in a minute. So you need the Xmla endpoint to get to the analysis services engine running behind the data set. So this tool relies on it. So if you are on Pro, you do have the option to upgrade to premium per user, which is probably more accessible to you than perhaps upgrading to premium. And so I think we announced the pricing for that, and it's basically double the price of Pro, but you have the option to upgrade an existing Pro license to premium per user, and then you'd be able to use it. So as you can see, it's a diff and merge tool. It's very simple in terms of the user interface. It does a lot of things in the background. You know, it kind of abstracts a lot of functionality, which I'll talk about, but it's easy to use. It's just these 6 or 7 buttons up here, and really that's it. All right, and so as Leon said, I also built Business Normalizer. So ALM Toolkit is its kind of lineage is based on BISM normalizer, which I started building, let me see, about 10 years ago. I started building this. It was like in a galaxy far, far away in another era. I built BISM normalizer, which is an extension for Visual Studio, and it works with SQL Server data tools, right? But and actually, there are a ton of users still using BISM normalizer today. And it's actually the same code base as ALM Toolkit. But obviously, most Power BI users don't use Visual Studio. So ALM Toolkit is like the new UI front end for this, right? So as I say, this one runs in Visual Studio. ALM Toolkit, this is actually a different diff control. This is the Monaco diff control that runs in Visual Studio Code. And the reason Mac Software have got their logo on there is because they built this UI part of it. And the ALM Toolkit usage is growing pretty significantly at the moment. And BISM Normalizer has had a strong user base for many, many years. All right.
That's very true, Christian. I can testify to that, being a BISM normalizer user in the analysis services days. If you don't mind, I'll just jump in with a question here because it's very much on point to where we are at the moment. And Haroon has asked if you can just elaborate and give a bit more of an introduction on the Xmla endpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, let me jump over to the slide for that and I'll come back to where I am here. Okay, on the capacity for Power BI Premium and for Premium per user, it's basically at the tenant level. You can enable the Xmla endpoint. So the Xmla endpoint is a protocol that was first defined. Like I said, we've been leading enterprise BI for over 20 years. So this was first defined in, I believe, 2002 by some of the leading BI vendors back then, including not just Microsoft, but it was like an industry standard that multiple BI vendors defined, including Hyperion, Essbase, and some others back then. And so we basically drove this standard, and we have our own kind of extensions to this standard. And this is what we use to allow client tools to connect to the analysis services engine. And so this is because we pretty much defined the standard and it became an industry standard. This is why there are so many other business intelligence client tools that can connect to an analysis services model, and like Tableau and Spotfire and MicroStrategy. It's more than just having connectivity to the model. They support the equivalent of Live Connect, where they will connect to the analysis services model and then allow the user to create reports that just generate MDX queries on the fly without having to copy all the data locally. And some of these competitor data visualization products started off building their businesses as client tools to analysis services because, as I said, we've been very dominant in the market for so long. And so we built this standard. It was primarily initially for these client tools to connect to the analysis services engine for data visualization. But we use it for much more than that, right? So we use it for, for metadata management operations, to invoke refresh operations, all of the, Power BI is effectively an XMLA client, SQL Server Management Studio, SQL Server Data Tools, ALM Toolkit. They're all basically tools that use the client libraries. So you can't actually connect to the Xmla endpoint directly. Technically you can, but it's unsupported. But what you do is you use client libraries that are available on NuGet, and you can then you then connect to the model through those client libraries. So there are a ton of other, like all the external tools like Tablet Editor and DAX Studio. All of these tools ultimately go through the XMLA endpoint. It's what we use to provide access to the analysis services engine, right? And so, as I said, this has been around a long time, but you never used to have access to the analysis services engine in Power BI, and it's only just hit general availability in January. It was in public preview for a while before January, but it's now generally available. So you can just come into your capacity. By default, it says read only. So by read only, it's going to allow users using, for example, Excel pivot tables to just connect straight to the Power BI dataset as though it were analysis services and create pivot tables. It's going to allow Tableau, MicroStrategy, Spotfire, all of these tools to connect to the Power BI dataset as though it were an analysis services database and create reports without copying data. It's going to allow, you know, Six Server Management Studio, Tablet Editor, DAX Studio, this whole ecosystem of tools and processes, and you know, all of the management processes to invoke refreshes in an automated way, whether you're using Azure Functions or Azure Automation, or you may be old school and you're using SQL Agent, right? You know, all of these things, they all go through the Xmla endpoint. They go through client libraries that connect through to the Xmla endpoint for, you know, for refresh management, for metadata management, for model creation, for client tool data visualization. Everything goes through this, right? So we've now opened it up on Power BI, which means that this vast ecosystem of partners, developers, tools, and processes that were built up on analysis services over 20 years have now move over to Power BI, and Power BI has inherited this massive community, right? Any more questions about Xml Endpoint?
Not currently. I would just go on record to say that it was the holy grail of Power BI releases. Definitely.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Leon. Yeah, it was a big deal for us. You know, it's super powerful. It just opens up the programmability in a big way, and the open platform connectivity. You know, so yeah, it's a pretty significant architectural feature. It's this little unassuming drop down. You don't realize what this thing is really implying or bringing along with it. Yeah. All right. So back over to ALM Toolkit. So ALM Toolkit is an Xmla client, like many others that I mentioned, right? And it, as you saw in the picture, it's a schema diff tool, right? And so the idea is, it's very similar to some other tools out there, like you may have seen deployment pipelines in Power BI for that again works in Power BI Premium and Premium per user. And so deployment pipelines gives you a visual guided experience. So a lot of Power BI, so Power BI works for enterprise BI, which is typically owned and managed by IT, and it works for self-service BI, where the business user is going to discover insights quickly and easily without a dependency on IT, and create their own reports and models on the fly, right? So it's one platform that works for both, that converges both enterprise and self-service BI, and there are lots of kind of efficiencies there. It's just a simpler messaging. You co-locate all of your artifacts, and you don't need to bridge the gap between self-service and enterprise BI like you used to back in the day. And you can take a self-service artifact, like a report that some analyst created that then becomes popular, and then you can maybe take that model that an analyst created and then use ALM Toolkit to bring it into an enterprise corporate model in development and iterate on it, and go through the kind of rigor that you get with enterprise BI in terms of corporate naming standards and best practices and et cetera. But the point being that having everything on a single platform, being Power BI Premium, that works for both enterprise and self-service BI, simplifies things a lot. Now, because it's a single platform, it needs to work for all of the types of users. So we will normally go more towards this. We'll always try and build the features in a way that works for the kind of low code, no code experience, for a visual guided experience that you don't need to learn a bunch of code. Now, it doesn't mean that if you do want that extra control for automation for things like through the Xml endpoint, you have that as well. But we won't typically just launch a feature and say, okay, you need to write 1,000 lines of code to use it. We'll give you something like deployment pipelines, and then we'll open up the back-end APIs to be able to invoke deployment pipelines operations through like a REST API and things like that. So the idea with deployment pipelines, I haven't got a picture of it, but the idea with deployment pipelines is very similar to the kind of schema diff experience that you saw earlier, where it will do a diff between all of your artifacts in your development and test environments. and then between all of your test and production environments. It's built into the Power BI service web experience. And then with that diff, you can pick and choose which artifacts you want to deploy across environments. And there's like some validation, some guardrails. For example, if the user wants to deploy a report that depends on a data set and they chose not to deploy the data set, then it will have validation to disallow that. So it's this visual guided low code, no code experience for deployment of artifacts, not just data sets, but reports, interactive reports, paginated reports, soon to include data flows, and all of the Power BI artifacts, basically, to deploy across environments. So it's quite similar to that, right? It's a visual guided experience for deployment. You can use it for that. It's also a schema compare tool, just like schema compare in SSDT. And Redgate has a pretty good SQL. Redgate SQL compare is a good schema diff tool as well that actually ships in Visual Studio. A baseline version of it ships in Visual Studio. So these are all, and schema compare is a massive market, right? Like companies like Redgate make good money out of schema compare for relational databases. And so when you use those tools, maybe you're deploying a new version of a data warehouse, you don't drop and recreate the whole data warehouse and reload all of the data, right? What you do is you create one option that is very common is you'll create a schema diff that will just bring the schema of the target data warehouse up to the latest version, add the necessary columns, etc., and retain all of the historical data. It's exactly the same with tabular models, right? It's like with analysis services and large models. In Power BI, we support models of up to 400 gigabytes, which is many terabytes of data, and it's raw, uncompressed form. You're not going to be able to reload all of that historical data unless you bring down the system for like a day or two, right? So it's very important to be able to do this kind of incremental metadata only deployment, just like we do for the data warehouse, right? So you can use it for those kind of deployment scenarios. I'm going to demo it in a moment for incremental refresh scenarios. Exactly the type of thing I described. You can use incremental refresh to get to really large model sizes. You don't want to reload all of the history, and you can use it this way for an easy way to deploy new. Like if you just want to like add a new measure to a model and you don't want to reload all of the history, you can use it for that. You can use it for kind of diff and merge across repos. For anyone who's familiar with the tabular object model metadata, that is the metadata for the analysis services tabular model, which is, as I said, what Power BI datasets are based on, you'll know that it's JSON based, but you can't just do a simple JSON merge like in Visual Studio Code, because there are so much dependencies between all of the objects. So we'll drill into that in a bit. And then you can use it for bridging the gap between self-service and corporate BI. Maybe quite often back in the day, people would create prototypes in Power Pivot and then do an import into analysis services. You can just use it for master metadata management. You have conform dimensions like product and date and customer that you want to share across models. There's a ton of different use cases, many of which I haven't even conceived of yet. All right, so I'll pause there, see if there's any questions or comments or anything.
Yes, Christian, that's fantastic. There are indeed. Okay. So we have a couple from Haroon. So the first question is, do we have to have Power BI Premium or Power BI Pro subscription to use ALM Toolkit and the functionality it offers?
Okay, so all right, so on the Power BI platform, you need either Power BI Premium or Premium per user or Power BI embedded ASKUs. They all contain the Xmla endpoint. Power BI Pro doesn't, for kind of technical reasons. One day we may re-architect Pro to allow this, but Pro doesn't. But as I say, if you've got Pro, you do now have the option, as of very recently, to upgrade for I think an extra $10 to Premium per user. I think that's $10 a month, and then you get to Premium per user, which has the Xmla endpoint in it and lets you use it. But you can also use it for analysis services like Azure Analysis Services, SQL Server Analysis Services. As I say, it's all of the same engine, so it works in lots of different products, but it doesn't work in Pro at the moment.
Absolutely, but as you mentioned there, Christian, I would point out to everybody on this call, if you do have the additional $10 per month, then it's definitely worth it to upgrade to premium. So please do that. I'll just move on to our next question, which is from Saravanan. And the question is the Xmla endpoint only applicable at the capacity level?
Well, so in SQL Server Analysis Services and Azure Analysis Services, the terminology there we use is server instead of capacity, but it's really the same thing. And in those cases, you connect to the server, you have a server name, just like you did back in the day with SQL Server Analysis Services. Whereas with Power BI, it's much more based on the workspace, right? So, with Premium Gen 2, we had to, especially knowing that our direction would be Premium Gen 2, the kind of unit that you connect to is the workspace in Power BI. So there's a URL endpoint for the workspace that you connect to as though it were a server or as though it were a capacity. Now, especially with Premium Gen 2, they're not physical capacities, right? With Premium Gen 2, they're virtual capacities that gives you access to, especially once we roll out the new hardware this summer, it will give you access to a node of a cluster of massive machines in the region, and much better concurrency and scalability. And so we've abstracted, rather than keeping like one physical server for every endpoint, which would mean every workspace, we've kind of taken care of that in the back end so that we can get the cloud level scalability to be able to get the benefits of a massive economy of scale of massive beefy machines on a big cluster, which will start rolling out this summer. So your answer is, in the modern kind of cloud world, it's not a single server or a single capacity. It's a virtual capacity, and you connect to the workspace, and your data sets could be on different physical nodes in the Gen 2 world.
Fantastic. And just as you mentioned Premium Gen 2, I was wondering, is it possible to move a current capacity into Premium Gen 2, or do you still have to create a new capacity?
Yeah, I believe you can definitely do that, Leon. So you can go into the capacity settings. It's still in public preview right now. And then you go into the capacity settings, and then you just flip it over. It's very, very easy. And then you're in the Premium Gen 2 world at that point. And eventually everything will go to Premium Gen 2. So currently it's in public preview. I think it will hit general availability around this summer, which is around when we'll start rolling out the new hardware as well, which will be, we're getting really good preliminary analysis on this new hardware. It seems to be significantly superior to the Premium Gen 1 and the Azure Analysis Services hardware. So yeah, you can go in and try it out. Try Premium Gen 2 by just going into the capacity settings and switching it over. But as I say, it's in public preview.
Fantastic. And there appears to be a small echo on my voice. I'm not too sure if it's on coming from your side or not, Christian. So what I'll do for the time being is I'll save the questions and we can continue with the demonstration for now.
Yeah, no worries. I'll just bring my volume down a little bit, since it's probably an echo on my end. So,
okay.
All right. Okay. All right. So we already discussed the Xmla endpoint that's available in Power BI Premium. That is a prerequisite that you have to come in and set it to read write. Another point is the large models storage format that I'd like to cover briefly, which is that, up until fairly recently, so Xmla endpoints is generally available as of January of this year. Large models is generally available as of December of last year. So these are both brand new in Premium. And the reason I'm calling out large models, so traditionally, if you wanted a model greater than 10 gigabytes and you needed like a P3 or above on Premium to get to 10 gigabytes, Pro only gives you 1 gigabyte and 1 gigabyte, and the kind of P1, P2s are somewhere in between. That was the maximum model size that you could have in Power BI was 10 gigabytes. But then if you wanted big, like highly scalable models, like with potentially, I do a demo quite often with 3 billion rows. It's about 70 gigabytes of data compressed from about 1.8 terabytes of data in its raw uncompressed form. And then you compress that into memory, you get blazing fast performance. I think it's completely fair to say that we have the fastest BI engine on the planet, right? So if you take that amount of data and you compress it into memory, you're going to get blazing fast performance. Users can create ad hoc reports in seconds, just clicky, draggy, droppy, and create these beautiful reports in seconds over massive amounts of data. The business users don't even need to know that creating reports so easily over such large data sets is even a technical challenge. They just go with it and they just run with it. But anyway, so we only recently announced this large models format, right? So as I said, anything beyond 10 gigabytes, like I say, 70 gigabytes, and then we've got the big end SKUs that will start launching in Premium Gen 2 this summer on the new hardware. That will be the P4, P5 level SKUs. That'll get you up to 400 gigabytes. That's all compressed into memory, and then you also have the option of direct query where you don't compress everything into memory. But for these large models, it's a different kind of architecture that we use to the small ones. And the reason I'm calling this out is that even on a 1 gigabyte model or a 2 gigabyte model or a 3 gigabyte model, it's going to be more efficient when you use ALM Toolkit against the Xml endpoint because of the way that we store the model. Like if for a small model, like a model on Pro, right? We actually every time you do a refresh or you publish a new version of the model, we have a backup of that model in the background, right? Whereas with Xml Endpoint, you can do all sorts of little metadata operations like ALM Toolkit. You can use it to just modify a measure. And that means in that small model storage format, it needs to create another backup of that model on the fly, which means which has had to be in the same transaction, right? So then it can take like a few minutes just to add a measure or modify a measure on a model that's maybe just 2 gigabytes big, right? So if you set it to this default storage format of the large model format, it stores the model in the same way that Azure Analysis Services does, like with files on the file system, which means that you can have a 100 gigabyte model and you can add measures and do metadata operations on it at sub-second speed, right? So that's the reason I'm calling this out, that if you set this, it's going to quite often mean that your XMLA write operations are going to be more efficient and perform better, and therefore ALM Toolkit will work better as well. Okay.
That's a very interesting point there, Kristen. So thank you for mentioning that, because I don't believe that any Microsoft documents go into that level of detail of how the actual model's stored.
Yeah, exactly. It's the type of thing, Leon, that I'd have trouble getting the docs guys to even get that far. And even if they did, people reading it would probably get about past the first paragraph and give up. So it's the type of thing that is much better to communicate in a session like this.
Definitely. That's definitely a golden nugget of information there. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, no worries. Okay, so as I said, it's a super easy tool to use. You can it's got its own little website, 5 buttons on it, pretty straightforward, right? So unless there's any further questions, I can jump straight into a demo.
Yep, I'd say let's continue for now.
Okay, all right, great. So here I am in my favorite tool, Power BI Desktop, right? And so I have this data model. So let's say this is my kind of semantic model. Let's say this is out there. This has already been deployed to the Power BI service some time ago, and I've got a ton of users using it all over the planet. And I've got maybe, let's say, 70 gigabytes of data compressed in it, which is 1.8 terabytes in its raw uncompressed form. And I've got a ton of reports, and there's users using it all over the place, right? Now, obviously, a 70 gigabyte model, as I said, it's going to have to be the large models storage format to get that big. And it's also going to have to use incremental refresh to get that big, right? If you do a refresh on a 70 gigabyte model and you don't have incremental refresh, then it's going to reload all of the data, which could take like maybe 3 hours, right? Perhaps. So you need something, you need incremental refresh to say, I only want to refresh the most recent data because that's all I need to refresh. And that's all I can refresh in like a 10-minute window to meet my SLA. I don't have 3 hours to refresh all the data, right? So to set up incremental refresh, I don't know if you guys are familiar with incremental refresh, but basically you come into you can just come into the incremental refresh dialog here, and then you set up the kind of rule. And in this case, I'm saying I want to store 10 years of data in total, but then every time I do a subsequent refresh, it will only incrementally refresh the last 1 day of data based on the date key of this table, which I've already configured in the background, which is why it's letting me come in here. You need to do that in the Power Query editor. It's pretty straightforward. So anyway, so I've set up incremental refresh, right? And then the first time I invoked, first thing I would do, I would publish the model with no data, because the version I have here in Power BI Desktop has like a few megabytes of data, right? It's only when you publish it to the, I don't have 100 gigabytes of memory on my machine, right? But I actually got a pretty decent laptop, and it's got, I think, 32 gig of memory. I don't have 70 gig of memory, right? Or 100 gigs of memory. So the version I have here in Power BI Desktop, it's just a few megabytes big. It's just like a sample of like 2 or 3 days of data. And then I publish it. I define this incremental refresh policy. I publish it up to the service. Before I invoke the refresh, I go in and enable large models if it's not already the default for that workspace, right? Then I invoke a refresh. The first refresh is going to take maybe 3 hours because it's going to load all of the historical 10 years of data. But then subsequent refreshes will just refresh the last 1 day, because that's all that I need to cover data changes. And it's much more efficient, much faster, right? And if I want to go back and do a backdated refresh of something from like 5 years ago, I can do that in SQL Server Management Studio, and I can see refresh just the relevant partitions, right? So I've already got it all set up with incremental refresh. The models are already out there in the service. It's already 70 gigabytes. It's already got a ton of users, and everything's set up. Then I come in here and I heard about external tools on, a community user group session. And I heard about these external tools, and I said, oh, I want to try out calculation groups and translations and things like that. So then I added my calculation groups and stuff to this model, and I want to now deploy a new version of it, right? So I'm going to come into publish, and I'm going to select my workspace. And then it says, do I want to replace the data set? And I really don't want to replace the data set, right? This publish flow is really geared for the self-service BI user that has just got small models that they just knock up on the fly. So I don't want to replace the data set. What I want to do is I want to just incrementally deploy the changes that I've made just to add the calculation groups and retain that data. I want to do like a schema diff and just pick the calculation group and push the calculation group or the measure or whatever it is without having to reload all of the data. So I do not want to replace the data set. So what I'm going to do initially, I'm going to click this view impact button, and this will take me over to the workspace. I get this lovely lineage view that's going to load that gives me like a 360-degree view from data source all the way through to dashboard, across workspaces, across data sets and data flows and reports, etc. And so here's my data set. And I can this will list all of the downstream workspaces and reports and dashboards and everything. And I can also use this to notify the owners of those downstream reports and data sets that I'm going to make a change to this data set. I'm going to add some really cool functionality that they might want to know about, right? So I can do that, and this kind of lineage view covers me for all of that. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to come in here to the settings, right, and then go to premium, because what I want to do is use this workspace connection, which is what I use in place of the Analysis Services server name. So this goes back to the discussion we were having earlier, right? I use this workspace connection, and I connect to it as all of the client tools and Tableau and Excel and everyone else, everyone just thinks it's an Analysis Services server, but it's not. It's an Xmla endpoint connection for this workspace, right? It's not a physical capacity. It's not a physical server. It's a workspace, and I connect to it. And I basically fool all of these client tools that have been built up over 20 years into thinking it's an Analysis Services server. So this little unassuming text box here has a lot of you know, heritage behind it, right? A lot of functionality and capabilities built into it, right? So I'll go ahead and copy this into my clipboard. Now I'll come back to Power BI Desktop, right? And I'll exit out of there because I definitely don't want to replace it. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to come over to the external tools ribbon, and I've got like a ton of these external tools, right? We launched this sometime last year, and it's just hit general availability. Kai Uncroft did a really good blog post about this. So we've got MVPs and people building external tools left and right. There's like external tools here for all this stuff that I had no idea what they were doing, like you know, test your Tableau report works against the data set. I mean, there's, you know, obviously over time we'd hope these Tableau, or we are confident that these Tableau users will gravitate to Power BI for data visualization as well, once they understand the full value proposition of Power BI for data visualization. But in the meantime, it's okay. You can run the whole idea of these corporate BI enterprise semantic models that are owned and managed by IT is that anyone in the organization can access that data and continue their decision making. We don't differentiate, oh, what tool you're using. We're confident over time everyone will gravitate to Power BI anyway, as they're doing now. But we don't differentiate. Like Xml Endpoint gives you that open platform architecture. So anyway, all of these tools, there's a ton of these tools out there. People have just created a ton of tools. Like there's the DAX Studio is a traditional analysis services tool. You've got Tablet Editor built by Daniel Otikia. So DAX Studio is now connected straight to the same Power BI desktop data set. And you've got Tablet Editor. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up ALM Toolkit. So basically you install ALM Toolkit and it sets it up for you, right? And then as you can see here, this is the same workspace connection, right? And the same data set that we chose not to overwrite. It just remembers it from the last time I ran it. But the source and target don't have to be this, right? The target can be a file. It can be a BIM file, right? That you could check into source control or something. You can see here, the target could be a PBIT file. The target can be many things, or it can be even the source can be another data set, for example, right? So you can pick and choose what you want there. So I'll go ahead and do this comparison to the data set, right? And then it will just connect up to the service and authenticate me, and then it will run the schema diff. And then we'll see every single object that is in the source model compared to every single object that's in the target model. So again, the source model is the model that I have here in Power BI Desktop that you can see here in the background, right, with these tables. So every table, for every M expression, for every relationship, for every measure, for every translation, everything is listed here. So anything that is the same in both the source and the target, this Monaco diff control that is used in Visual Studio Code shows me the same. But if there's something that is different, like for example, I've added this calculation group and it doesn't exist in the target, then I can see, you know, exactly what the differences are, right? Or for example, this game table is the one with incremental refresh. And so I can see exactly what the differences are in the metadata, right? And so I can see all of these partitions in the target. So this is what incremental refresh does, is it creates all of these partitions. And I don't want to blow up. I don't want to lose these partitions, right? If I lose these partitions, I'm going to have to reload all of that data. So what am I going to do? I just skip it. I just don't update. I don't touch that table. And there's other options over here that I can use for this as well, like retain only incremental refresh, policy-based partitions. But there's a ton of these options as well. So I'll skip that table. I will now hide skip objects to just focus on the differences in the model, right? And for whatever reason, I'm not ready to deploy these measures. I'm still working on them, right? If I'm doing like a bug fix or something, and there's a ton of other things in my development environment that aren't ready to be deployed, I don't need to deploy them. I can pick and choose what I want to deploy, and I can deploy them in a safe way because of the validation that you're going to see in a minute. I've got this trip table that I don't want to delete, right? So I can skip this either using the drop down or the context menu, and then I don't want to delete any of this other stuff either. So I could skip them all individually, or I can, if I delete again, I can skip everything in one go with this menu option, skip all objects missing in source. So all of the delete objects get skipped in one go. The reason this is useful is if you think about it, like if you're doing a prototype or something in Power BI Desktop, and then you want to then merge those objects into your corporate semantic model in your development environment and integrate it into there. There'll be a ton of stuff in your target model you don't want to mess with, right? So there could be thousands of these objects, so that you don't need to skip all of the delete objects one by one. You can just do them with this menu option over here, right? And then, so what am I left with? I'm left with this calculation group and these translations, right? So this is Portuguese, and so I want to deploy, and I'm going to hide the skip objects again. And now I'm just looking at the ones that I'm really going to apply to the target model, just the translations and the calculation group. Then I do the validation, and it's going to ensure the integrity of the target model, right? So and this is actually 70% of the code behind this is just validation code, right? So if it's going to check things like, if I'm trying to create a relationship that refers to a column that doesn't exist, or if I'm trying to create a table that has a Power Query or an M expression for that partition that refers to another M expression that refers to another M expression that doesn't exist. It's gonna, like, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a ton of this validation code, right? So for example, here, I got this calculation group, and calculation groups depend on discourage implicit measures. So I'm just gonna, if I didn't know that, and I wasn't updating it, right? And then I do the validation again, and then it says, sorry, you can't create the calculation group because you haven't got discourage implicit measures set to true, right? And then because I don't have the calculation group, I can't create the calculation items either. So I can't stress how important this is. This is what makes this tool usable, right? This is what protects the integrity of the target model. This is what makes it possible to just deploy a measure for a bug fix without having to deploy everything else that you're still working on in your development environment. This is what makes it that helps you in these kind of agile scenarios where you want to just push specific objects that you need to for your users without worrying about everything else. You can pick and choose very selectively in a safe way because it does all of this validation. This really illustrates that, you know, doing diff and merge for tabular models, for analysis services tabular models and Power BI datasets, is much more complex than just a simple JSON merge in Visual Studio Code, because you will break it pretty quickly. You need to make sure that all of the interdependencies line up. This is what makes this tool usable, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and update this again, and now I run the validation again, and then now we're back to everything's good. And I'll go ahead, and at this point I can update the target model directly. I could also generate a report. I could generate a script, like a tabular model scripting language script that I can open in SQL Server Management Studio to run later if I want. But in this case, I'll go ahead and just update the target. And so it'll push the calculation group and the translations over to the target. So if you think about this, like, there's a ton of scenarios you could use this for, right? Not just deploying this, like you can use your imagination, right? You know, you can use it for master metadata management. You can use it for just conform dimensions across models. There's a ton of just you know, reusing certain objects that you want to reuse in all of your models and things like that, right? So having done that, I will now refresh this. And we will see that the objects that we push through, like the calculation group, are now the same in the source and the target, but the objects that we skipped, like the game table, are still different, right? So I didn't touch them. So these objects that we skipped, they still have a status here of skip, right? So we didn't touch any of those objects. And the last thing I'm going to show here is what I can do is I can actually save this as an ALMT file. So I'll save this as a file. Right, now I'm going to close this and I'm going to reopen that file. No, sorry, here. So I'm going to reopen that file straight from the file system, and you'll see that it remembers the source and the target in the file. It's also going to remember the options, right? And it's going to remember everything, right? So once this has done its schema diff, the state that I'm in is exactly the same state that I was in before I saved the file, right? So let me just make this big. So you can see exactly the same skip items with the game table, all of the same skip stuff, all of the options were remembered, the source and the target. The reason this is useful is that if you're deploying to a particular environment, there's a lot of repetition in what you select in terms of, like, you don't want to have to remember to make sure that you have this checked every time and be at risk of losing all of the partitions. You want it to be stored in the file so that it minimizes manual intervention and manual error, because then you can reopen. If there's a certain role that you never want to mess with because it's always a different set of users, because this supports the model roles as well. So for RLS roles and things like that. So maybe there's a different set of users in your test environment versus your production environment. You never want to touch that role. You just have it skipped and it's saved in the file. You never need to remember to skip it manually and be at risk of like clearing out all of the users from the role, right? There's a ton of these little details that you want to have the same when you deploy across each environment. In fact, this was a really common way of how people used to use the old version of this, BISM normalizer, which would run like this in Visual Studio. People would create these BISM files. This is a file here in Visual Studio. And then you can create a new one of these for each environment, right? So that you know, when you're deploying to development or to test, then you have exactly the same settings. Yeah, so this is a way that a lot of people would use it. And last quick comment here, and then we'll leave the last 10 minutes for questions, is you know, even if you're using the traditional kind of CI/CD deployment methodologies based on DevOps pipelines with automation and those types of things, this is still super useful, right? If you think about it, even in number one, you may not have had the time or the bandwidth to set up your deployment pipelines and your CI/CD pipelines yet, and you can use it in the meantime. And even if you have, like, you will need a repo or a branch for your bug fixes, right? For your production branch, for your bug fixes that maybe you know you don't want to do a full deployment for. But when you need to do a bug fix really quickly. Well, when you do that bug fix, you want to put that back into the main branch without doing the same thing manually again, right? Or you've got different developers that are working in parallel that you then want to merge their changes. There's just a ton of different scenarios, right? The diff and merge in the development world is super popular, you know, at Microsoft, and that's why tools like Visual Studio Code support it. So you know, all of the scenarios you would need this in one way or another. All right, so with that, I will just stop talking because I've been talking a little while and see if there's any questions or anything.
No problem at all, Christian. Absolutely fantastic presentation. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
I've still got a slight echo.
Yeah, no worries. Let me turn the volume down a bit more. Maybe that'll help. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that's slightly better.
Yeah,
perfect. Okay, so I'll just go straight into some questions.
Yeah.
So we have another one from Haroon, and the question is there an Azure SQL database behind this model with regard to incremental refresh or any other database?
Is there an Azure SQL database behind the model? So in this particular case, this model is getting data from an Azure Synapse instance. It's one that I've used for a bunch of demos. But yeah, it can, in fact, you can look at, no, it doesn't. If you look at the M expression, you can see that it says from source SQL database, and that's my Synapse instance. Yep. So yes, there is.
Okay, perfect. And then we're going on to a question from William. So his company is looking into AAS as a way to scale out Power BI without having to spend the big bucks on P1 capacities. Would you say the investing effort in the switch is worth it given the overlapping of features between Premium and AAS? And is that where we're seeing thanks to tools like ALM Toolkit?
Yeah, so good question. So ALM Toolkit will work on the Power BI dataset, the Power BI Premium dataset, or Azure AS. And, you know, a lot of customers traditionally would choose Azure AS because it had features like Xml Endpoint that Power BI didn't have until recently, or it had large models, which Power BI didn't have until recently. Right? And I think the person mentioned scale out. Well, things will be different on the Premium Gen 2 architecture, and we will eventually do scale out in Premium as well. But Premium is already scaled out in the context that it's already scaled across a big cluster of nodes, right? So I would say that it's actually more strategic to think about Premium in the long term, right? So there are options like Premium per user now that make it more cost effective. And there will be other options that we launch in the future. And eventually, Azure AS is going to be around practically forever, but the point being that things will start working the Power BI way, right? And so if you do, things work differently in Power BI, right? So if you set up your model in Azure AS, then you need to set up, if you use a gateway, you do it the Azure AS way. If your security model is the Azure AS way, it's not, Power BI is a different security model with like the build permission and the workspace roles. And the log analytics integration is different. There's lots of little things that just work. They work in Power BI, but they just work differently, right? And it's more strategic in the long term to do things the Power BI way, right? So I'm not saying, certainly for a new project, I'd recommend you look at Power BI, maybe Premium per user, and that will hopefully mean that it's more cost effective. And Premium per user now supports models of up to 100 gigabytes. Premium per user will run on the Gen 2 architecture, and we'll get you that concurrency that Azure AS doesn't even have, because it's going to be scaled out across all of these nodes. So I would recommend that you at least look at Premium in one way or another, because it's just more strategic for the longevity of the project.
I totally agree. And Christian, can I ask a cheeky question? Can we officially, unofficially say that Power BI is the future, considering that not many companies use MDX models anymore, and the tabular model exists within Power BI now?
Yeah, I think that's fair, Leon, one way or another. Like the reality is, like, there's two flavors of SQL Server Analysis Services, as you pointed out, right? There's multidimensional, which you write your MDX scripts and stuff, and then you've got tabular models, which supports MDX queries, but you do all your calculations in the model in DAX. Now, multidimensional, we're seeing much less new development in multidimensional these days. But there is still a big population of these legacy models that were built in multidimensional. And a lot of them want to move to the cloud, and they can use, VMs and IaaS to move to the cloud. We don't have a plan to include multidimensional as a platform as a service, or even as part of Power BI or anything like that. And then on the tabular model front, as you said, the Power BI dataset is based on the tabular engine. And going forward, that's where the investment's going. So, it's based on the same engine, but as I say, things work differently in Power BI. So it's more strategic, and it's more aligned with the future direction to do things the Power BI way, and to at least see if you can get the model in Power BI.
Perfect. Okay, so we move on to the next question, and it's from Sarah Banan. And the question is, what is the impact of the schema change in the table? So is there additional Power Query transformations? So this is when you updated the measures using ALM Toolkit. Are there any transformations pushed back to Power Query in that update?
Okay, so good question. So it depends, right? If I, for example, let's say the game table, I didn't update it at all, so it's exactly the same. And then let's say another table like currency conversion, I have the option to make an update to the table and still retain this is a calculated table, so it doesn't have an M expression. Sorry, that's a calculation group rather. But if I find this one, so this one's got an M expression, right? So I have the option to not touch the M expression, and this M expression may refer to other expressions like it can refer to, this is a parameter and this is a separate M expression. So I have the option I have a lot of control. I can either update all of the table, all of the definition of the table. I have the option to retain the partition, right? So this M expression is part of the partition object in the table. So if I come back to this guy, and then as you can see, this M expression is part of the partition object, right? So I have the option to retain the partition. Now in this scenario for a regular table, you probably don't want to do that. The main case where you want to retain the partition is when you use incremental refresh, right? But yeah, you have all the options. You can retain the partition, so you retain the M expression. You can overwrite the M expression and not overwrite other M expressions that it refers to. You can for an incremental refresh table, you can update the policy for the incremental refresh policy. You can delete a column. You can change the data type on a column and still retain all of the partitions and not touch those partitions or the M expressions associated with them. So there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of detail.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, huge amount. And I'm going to give you some quick fire questions if you don't mind, Christian, because I'm conscious of your time. So back to this one's from William. Does Premium Gen 2 address these scaling concerns, e.g. peak usage hours, multiple import refreshes in terms of savings?
Yeah, that's a great question. You couldn't have phrased it more nicely for me, because that's a great summary of exactly, some of the key value proposition that Premium Gen 2 gives you, right? Because if you think about it, especially once we roll out the new hardware this summer, right? Even if you buy like a P3 that has a limit on one data set can't be over 100 gigabytes. I might go over a minute or two, Leon, but
that's fine.
So one data set can't go over 100 gigabytes, right? Whereas a P3 on Gen 1, you had all of the data sets on that one physical capacity had to be up to 100 gigabytes, right? So, and it's the same with Azure AS, right? All of that, like you can have an S4 with 100 gigabytes. All of your data sets have to fit within 100 gigabytes, which means that they can step on each other's toes very easily. And there's a risk of getting out of memory exceptions, especially when you do refreshes, because refreshes require so much more memory, because as it's refreshing the data, not all of the data is compressed yet. So you can get these spikes in memory consumption, especially when you're doing refreshes, and especially actually on Azure AS, because all of the models are loaded in memory all of the time, you can get these out of memory exceptions. Whereas Premium Gen 2 solves that, right? Because with Premium Gen 2, you will scale out across a cluster of nodes. So you could have like 5 data sets and they could all be on different nodes. And the 100 gigabytes on a P3 will be per data set, right? So you could have like 5 data sets, all of maybe 70 gigabytes each, that then all refresh concurrently at the same time. That was physically impossible on Premium Gen 1, right? You get much better refresh concurrency, a lot less risk. The total cost of ownership is significantly lower because of this, right? You don't need to, live in fear that your refreshes are going to get out of memory for whatever unforeseen reason, right? So this is the primary benefit from the kind of management overhead perspective of Premium Gen 2. So great question.
Perfect, fantastic.
Yeah.
Another one from Haroon. Are we referring to a Power BI data set somewhere in production getting compared with the dev data set before it's deployed to the production data set?
Absolutely. You can do it however you want, right? You can do it. I've seen people that will compare their version maybe in their modeling tool, whether it be desktop or SQL Server data tools, with the version in dev. Then they can push the certain objects from dev to test, from test to production, or you can have you can have all of the different configurations for deployment. It simply works as a source and a target, and you can save this configuration to a file. So you can use your imagination and you can configure this however suits your requirements, depending on your own processes of how agile you need to be and how responsive you need to be and how automated you need to be. So, and you can run this from a command line as well if you want as well. So yeah, it's pretty flexible in that respect.
Totally agree. Okay, another question. This one's from Ginsu. If I am correct, for enterprise development, multi-developers can work in the same project at the same time using ALM Toolkit, and they can do the merge easily? Yeah, so certainly it depends on the modeling tool that you're using, right? So this is so with SQL Server data tools, you have which is over here. You can just, this is the JSON for
the model right here, right? And so different developers can be working in parallel, and then you can diff and merge the repos back into one using ALM Toolkit. Now, and you can do that with Tablet Editor, for example, and Tablet Editor has other capabilities that actually breaks out this BIM file into lots of little files, so that you don't like get versioning discrepancies when multiple developers try and check in the same file. So that there's the Tablet Editor has breaks out the bin file into separate files, and you can have multiple repos and multiple developers working in parallel, and you can use ALM Toolkit or BIM Normalizer to merge the changes. So yes, you can do that. Now with Power BI Desktop, there's currently there's only certain metadata operations that you can change because we need to do some work for Power BI, which we plan to do, for Power BI Desktop to be hardened to external model changes, right? So, for example, you can use Tablet Editor and you can add a calculation group, but you can't add an M expression because we're not guaranteed that you're not going to break Power BI Desktop right now. So we disallow that right now. So, and this is purely a limitation of Power BI Desktop that we plan to relax in the not too distant future. But the short answer is yes, you can. It just depends on what your modeling tool is.
Perfect. Another question from, let's go with Mark Lund because it's quite a long question. So we have a report which needs to be refreshed every hour to show up-to-date info. The model has two large fact tables, both set up using incremental refresh. Fact 1 is only updated at source once a day. Fact 2 is updated at source every hour. Is there a way to set one to refresh with the report, e.g. each hour, and the other only once a day to reduce load on source?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So you can use Xml Endpoint, right? I don't have SQL Server Management Studio open, but you have very, very fine-grained control over what you refresh, and including with integration with incremental refresh. So you can pick, like with the Power BI service, you go in and you just refresh the whole data set, right? But with SQL Server Management Studio, if I had a few more minutes, I would just open it and show you. But with SQL Server Management Studio, you can create what we call a tabular model scripting language command that will process just one table or one partition, or like 3 tables, but not all of them. You have complete control over what you want to do. You can also automate refreshing incremental refresh tables where there's a bunch of like incremental refresh parameters that you can override. You can set what the current date is, and incremental refresh might help you as well. Incremental refresh has the capability to set up all these fine-grained scenarios. Like you can have something like, if I quickly show you here, I can say, and Patrick LeBlanc, I don't know if you know Patrick LeBlanc. He has an awesome video that I can send you, Leon, that shows you how, that you can share, that shows you exactly how to do this, right? So what you can do is, let's say I've got 10 years of data, and that's my total data set, and then I've got 10 days, and then for the 10 days, every time I do a refresh, it will refresh the 10 days. Now, what I can also do is I want to say detect data changes. And Patrick LeBlanc has a way that you can, instead of picking a particular date column in here, you can use another M expression, like a simple Power Query, to detect, okay, out of those 10 days, only the one day 8 days ago needs to be refreshed, which is more efficient than 10 days, right? Of course. So you can query the source system and say, well, I'm only going to refresh the data that has changed. And if no data's changed, every hour you run this thing. And if no data's changed, you don't refresh anything. But if it has, then you just pick the day 6 and 8 that needs to be refreshed. You don't even refresh all 10 of them, right? So you have really, really fine-grained control. And I can send you some and Patrick LeBlanc uses ALM Toolkit to do this. So I can send you a link to his videos because they're really, really cool.
Yeah, please, if you could. And I mean, this is kudos to the work of you and your team, because opening up the Xmla endpoint basically put Power BI Premium into the Analysis Services Enterprise League, should we say, in terms of being able to have that fine grind, refresh, incremental, etc.
Exactly right.
This is why it's so huge.
Leon. I couldn't have put it better myself. I put it in Enterprise League in a big way because it's going to leverage 20 years of Enterprise BI as being the leader in Enterprise BI. All of that is now inherited by Power BI. So couldn't have put it better myself.
Exactly. The only point I'll put on that, which is a request and pretty much a beg to you and your team, is if you can incorporate fully functional multiple developer support for data sets, Leon, then it's game over.
Keep asking the question. Every time I get the question, I raise it up to the leadership team. Look, keep asking the question. We need to, that desktop hardening thing that I mentioned, where desktop doesn't allow external model changes. Once we do that, that will enable, source control integration. It will enable multi-developer scenarios. It will enable version control, roll back to different version, and then reopen it in Power BI Desktop. It will allow download to PBIX and PBIT from XMLA modified models in the service. That's the same reason you can't do download to PBIX from an incremental refresh model, because Power BI Desktop doesn't know how to handle multiple partitions, right? So just keep asking, because eventually we will get there. I'm this close to getting funding to doing what you just asked for. So just keep asking and we'll make it happen.
I definitely will do, because we have to work around currently. So technically it can be done with a BIM, but again, there's a barrier to entry there.
For sure. Send me all the evidence. Send me all the evidence. Yeah.
Oh, I will. They've got a massive use case. So currently, and I'll just digress briefly because I'm having too much fun at the moment. So working for a FTSE top 10 company using ALM Toolkit day in, day out. So the way I'm currently using it is an offline version of the model, building out any additional functionality, measures, etc., and then using our repoed version that's being worked on by multiple developers, so we can't check out too often. So just doing my work locally and then updating that model literally within a minute or 2 minutes with ALM Toolkit. So fantastic use case there. Brilliant. But with 8 Power BI developers working in that environment, that's where we can all come together, just like the old days of analysis services, and be able to update it. So we have a massive use case, and I'm pretty sure Microsoft are aware of this.
Brilliant. So. Yeah, I want to raise visibility of these, Leon. So good
fantastic
stuff.
Okay, cool. So I'll go back to a last question, if that's okay.
Okay.
There are a couple, so I'm going to try and choose. Okay. So I think we've just answered this one, which is there any possibility of Power BI datasets to be introduced as a project type extension in Visual Studio?
Not really. We would probably not. What we'll probably do is, once we do the desktop hardening that Leon was alluding to there, we could potentially have Power BI Desktop extract the metadata files onto the file system, just like SSDT creates the BIM file. And then that would give you at least the minimum viable product way of getting those files into source control and rolling back to previous version, making changes, and then still being able to reopen Power BI Desktop. That's probably the path of least resistance that we will be focusing on initially. And then we'll look at, do we put GitHub integration into Power BI Desktop, or do we go back to Visual Studio or something like that? We'll figure that out later.
Fantastic. What I'll do, I'll hold the rest of the questions there, because what I think needs to happen is we need to get you back, Christian, because I've had too much fun. And I think that there's so much more to explore within this realm, and it's a plethora of good information that I'm surprised that not a lot more developers use ALM Toolkit, and I'm very keen to change that. So if we can have you back again, that would be amazing.
Absolutely, Leon. Thank you so much for setting this up. It was a lot of fun. Really appreciate it, and look forward to hopefully seeing you guys in person sometime, and just seeing you guys again whenever we can.
Definitely. Thank you very much for your time. And I just want to say thank you to our sponsors as well. So Onyx Data for having us for this event. And thank you to everybody that's joined us, because you could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group with our guest this evening, Christian Wade.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.